I will now share my screen with you, and I'm going to introduce you to our paper as the conceptual underlying theme of this workshop. As you know, as scholars of Volpower, as well as a certain team of scholars based at Glasgow Caledonian University, we are quite interested in narrative research. This had been my focus throughout my career as well, to understand practically how political discourse and increasingly how political visuals and imagery create their audiences. I studied this conceptual issue looking into various contexts. Migration is one of them. I published a book looking into the construction of gender discourse in Turkish mosque sermons, using the Foucauldian neoliberal governmentality approach. And I'm running at the moment another two projects. One of them is a project called Demos. It's a populism project. And there I'm interested in how people, how citizens, they negotiate their identities vis-a-vis the populist discourse in various European countries. And finally, during last summer, with some colleagues from the Volpower project, as well as another 12 partners, we won a huge new Horizon 2020 project on radicalization, which I'm leading as well from Glasgow, which is also interested in this theme, practically how people there negotiate their identities when they hear narratives. As well as how narratives they establish their audiences within their particular kind of target groups. So in this paper as well, we try to understand like how the South narrativize itself, looking into migrant experiences and where the migrants they situate themselves when they hear about the macro narratives of inclusion, and then how practically they follow these narratives. Or else, how do they really develop certain methods in order to make themselves belonging to the societies where they live? And this research is coming out from the Volpower project because we've been looking into how young migrants they negotiate their identities and how they express themselves, make themselves part of the wider society through volunteering, which we call as a mundane everyday activity. And then we believe that there's something out there in the everyday, what happens in everyday sites, in order to understand social inclusion much better. And then we also propose that this goes way beyond indicators of integration, because indicators cannot really describe what happens in everyday sites all that well. So this is where this particular paper is coming from, and then we're going to give a background of this research, and then we're going to introduce you to our particular approach. We're going to present some empirical material, the theoretical framework of narrative research and social inclusion research, which, as I mentioned, is laying the groundwork of the book to come. And we're going to present our particular theoretical puzzle, research question, a short analysis, and conclusions. So this should take around 20 to 30 minutes. I'm going to give a certain kind of a background of this research, and then Doga is going to present the theoretical framework and the particular puzzle here. And finally, I'm going to conclude the paper. So before actually starting this presentation, I want to mention two empirical findings. The first one is a policy paper that's published by Grimmer, a research project that's based at the University of Edinburgh, looking into integration as well as carrying out urban research. So they had a policy paper looking into the results of the Syrian vulnerable person settlement program. Those of you who are based in the UK would know that the UK government has established a vulnerable person settlement program, particularly for Syrians, and then certain UK council areas, they received Syrian refugees and settled them. And then we came across this policy paper looking into Isle of Bute, which is a council area to the west or southwest of Glasgow. Now, it is a deprived area. So yesterday there was some talk about, there was a presentation from Norma, I believe, looking into whether migrants, they would regenerate economic growth in deprived areas, and Umut is once again a deprived area. Now, a review of their experiences and their integration journey showed that refugees presented a great deal of ambition to pursue careers and achieve the crucial element of integration, that's finding employment. I believe this is not a big surprise. But they failed in another element of integration because they could not learn the language. Why? Ultimately, probably they were pretty much stuck in their own particular communities, and they did not really have much of an engagement with wider society. This happens in many, many cases. There's nothing singular here in terms of the Butte example. It happens to minorities, migrants most of the time. But the question here is whether we can consider them as integrated even if they barely speak, or should we say that they are not integrated even if they achieve to have joined the labor market? Because as you know, speaking the language as well as finding employment are both indicators of integration. Now, in that case, the question becomes, just like in the Schrodinger's cat example, do we in this case consider them both integrated and not integrated at the same time? Because they achieved one level of integration, that's finding labor, but however, they failed in another one, that is learning the language. So this is quite puzzling for us. If we were to follow indicator-oriented integration research, where do we straight them? The second one is taken from Respond project. Respond was another Horizon 2020 project, which I served as a principal investigator for research in UK and Hungary. And this is an interview taken from Respond fieldwork and an interview with a refugee in Glasgow. It's a bit chunky, but I mean, I just want to give you the gist of it because it's quite interesting. So this person speaking, when you hear the integration, the question is, why aren't you integrating into our society, Scottish society? Sometimes the interpretation is you need to change your values, your culture, which is hard. Some people, they love to do that, they want to, but you don't want to lose your values or your culture. That's why people, they prefer to stay at home, to be isolated, because they are scared if they go there with a different color, different value, they might not get a welcome, etc. I mean, we find these things in Volpower project as well, which I think are part of Marcus's paper this afternoon. But that's not true in all parts of the country and city, but there's a misrepresentation of integration, I think. So there he starts. Integration is from both sides coming together, working together, living together. There's a grasp of community I've seen and I've lived with, spent time with them, but sometimes it's unbalanced. One way, just send the orders, say like a mother with a child, listen to me, you need to do that, that's not right. It's a hierarchy. Integration became a hierarchy you don't deserve. You need to change lots of stuff in order to be here because da, da, da. And then he says that there's a two-way responsibility, that is local communities and minorities come together, they work together, they need to do that, you have to chase people, etc. So the message here is actually, yesterday it was part of a talk discussion as well, that integration imposes or demands practically a two-way responsibility. So it's not necessarily the newcomer that has to integrate, but also the society has to embrace the newcomer. And then here, throughout the Volpower project, we've been trying to understand practically the mechanisms of this and how their relationship is mitigated as they start to share each other's circumstances. So coming from there, to these two anecdotes, I'd like to introduce our paper, that is Integration of Migrants Matters, but we hardly understand what integration entails. I think many of you would agree with this thing. And then we do not really agree that indicator-oriented integration research is sufficient in order to describe what integration would entail. The fundamental principles of integration are increasingly criticized. These are just a few names. I know that there are other names as well. While an indicator-informed integration, which we call as I approach, remains an aspiration for policymakers. Why is that? Because as yesterday Jenny was also saying, this is quite easy to grasp. It's quite easy to crack for policymakers. In that case, integration simply becomes a box-ticking exercise. In contrast, in this paper, we argue that integration, and in particular its social variant, cannot be measured through indicators. It's even a fallacy to qualify one's integration journey through indicators. Instead, we argue that we need to understand migrant integration as an everyday phenomenon that relates to the course of one's life in their new home country. And we propose that we need to understand the narrative that this process involves and the intimacies that it generates. So throughout this paper, we're interested in the joint narratives, the joint belongingness that's built between the newcomer and their hosts, as well as the social intimacies that they construct, consolidate as they start to share each other's circumstances. And then the Volpower contribution, to this paper is that it is the data that comes from young people's description, recollections of their time as volunteers, and how during the time of volunteer they started to share the circumstances of each other and the wider society. Now I'm going to shift to Doga, and he's going to give the theoretical gist of the paper.
Hi everyone. I'm going to start with the main 4 problems with integration literature. First, integration can resemble a neo-colonial imposition or nation-state construction demanding from the migrant as the other to assimilate. That makes those societies a superior group that resembles the hierarchical relationship that the new nation-states cultivated in their relationship with the other. That is why an integration approach, wanting to make the migrants part of a whole, misses the point that there will always remain hierarchy in this process as long as it is the nation state that defines what composes the whole. In this regard, without a nation state, in fact, there will be no migration or integration discussion. And in fact, the integration literature that we criticize appears nothing but a search for a scientific proof to the integration policies, the policymakers. This demands integration to be continuously assessed with the quantitative measures of migrant socioeconomic performances in comparison to the non-migrant population. The III research that we called ultimately assumes that the integration journey comes to an end when the host society accepts the migrants. This means that the most important aspect of the integration for such research is to provide migrants with a legal status that bridges equal opportunities, accessing to education, healthcare, and employment. These also appears as the most common indicators of the integration. So in our terminology, we will call the migrants as newcomers, the community as host society, migration as mobility, and integration as social inclusion. For our research, social inclusion should contain the followings. The first one is informality and cross-communal relationship based on interest similarities as expressed in sharing leisure activities such as sports or arts. The second one, social interaction to qualify the mobility journey once the newcomer becomes part of the circumstances of their host. And the final one, self-narration and social intimacies. We take the relationship like friendships as intimate relationship to, I need to note that. The data we show you today comes from the interviews with those identify themselves as newcomers across the 2 EU-funded projects. First one is the Horizon 2020 Respawn project, and the second one is EU MIF project Volpower. We explore social interactions that come about in the mundane situations such as volunteering, in effect to generating similar interest and inclusive environments. We must note that similar interests can range from having leisure activities, like I said, sports or art, but to share the experience through cultural activities or trying to new cuisines. The literature focuses on indicators to evidence, yet integration story actually rests on the narratives and joint narrative construction between the newcomer and their hosts. And the literature also aims to achieve fully integrated societies, which we believe is unachievable. But what matters is the bolstering inclusive environments whereby meaningful contacts facilitate the expression of self-narratives for both the newcomer and the host. Therefore, our argument impinges on the need for integration research to focus on what qualifies social interactions and related intimacies. We are particularly interested in developing a conceptual condition, that is, how one's expectations from socially intimate relationships are fulfilled with the reception of their self-narratives by the other. How this affects social inclusion. In order, we'll look at the most mundane situations and take volunteering as a way to harness social interactions, though we also recognize that there could simply be other similar mechanisms such as sports and arts again. Our starting point, actually, the people seek intimate relationship primarily through first narrating themselves to themselves before reaching out to the other. After that, each answer to who am I question constructs our self-narratives. After that, self-narratives affect prospective interactions with the wider society as hosts once newcomers arrive at their new localities. So our main research question, how do joint narratives emerge between newcomers and hosts following their interactions and resulting social intimacies? Most common way to build an intimate relationship is finding similar interests with others. Hereby, we need to clarify that our primary interest is neither geared to explore where self-narrative originates from, nor the conditions of their journeys. We acknowledge that they are relevant, but we concentrate on how self-narratives affect prospective interactions with the wider society as their hosts after they arrive. We propose that in order for self-narratives to involve social intimacies, three conditions should be fulfilled. These are namely environmental, contextual, and conceptual factors. We consider setting up equal relationship between the migrant and host and providing them both with equal access to rights to services such as education, healthcare, and housing, as well as employment, are the most basic environmental conditions. What we take as a contextual factor is that the legacy of mobility within where the migrant and the host interact with each other. However, we are particularly interested in developing a conceptual condition, that is, how one's expectation from socially intimate relationships are fulfilled with the reception of their self-narratives by the other and how this affects social inclusion.
Okay, just to wrap up actually quite quickly, I come back because I want to have some discussion here as well. We thank Doga for the presentation thus far. So how do interactions and social intimacies come about? So self-narratives matter to affect how people engage with the other in everyday relationships. As we said, we're interested in looking into similar interests to develop potential intimate relationships, right? So we have a few quotations here from various Volpower volunteers. One person said, Volpower project is a bit of a family. I found people who are like me. So this is quite interesting for us. Also saying that they have a bit of the same way of facing things, the same point of view. So for us, this is also a sign of intimacy. You can also see that when the people knew each other before they volunteered, they become even closer as they came across having similar interests to affect their environments and relationships. In the quotation, I met X there, I knew them before. When we arrived in Italy, you know, we arrived on the same day, but we were not as close as we are now. Why? Because they managed to establish social intimacies, and then hence they started to relate to each other's circumstances much closer. So we have three stages here. The first one is forging interpersonal relationships. This is how we understand how social inclusion is built through intimacies, and then we come across fitting and not standing out as one's expectations for establishing intimacy with the other. I believe Mark's paper will also talk about these issues in the afternoon. So an interview here, you're just part of it. I'm not paying attention. You know, when you walk into a room, when everyone knows each other, you're the outsider, then everyone's looking at you. But if no one is paying attention, so for us, this is not fitting and not standing out a sign of that. you feel at home, right? This is another sign of intimacy once again. We came across that language can be an instrument of exclusion, even when the other speaks the local language fluently. Another interview here, when I came to Glasgow, I felt left out. You know, I was just a regular African English speaking girl. I had an English accent, but I didn't have any idea about the Scottish accent. So this is where my question to Jenny yesterday on linguophobia came from. So this is practically what happens when someone stands out, when someone not fits in. You know, they cannot really, in that case, establish intimacies, and then they cannot really be part of the wider society either. The second one, the evolution of sense of belonging. So for us, this is the second stage. The expression of self-narratives has a significant impact on how individual interactions evolve into social intimacies as well. So someone from Rotterdam says, I'm really part of the community now. I realize I see it more as a second home than just a place where you are sometimes. So your sense of belonging has evolved thanks to practically your understanding the intimacies, the social intimacies of the other. The third one is when self-narratives start evolving into joint narratives, and for us, this is a sign of socially inclusive societies. And Volpower project looked into volunteering as a mechanism of that. So this is a mechanism that facilitates self-narratives evolving to joint narratives. So let's look at this one. Now that we're just a soccer group and that we meet and train every week or twice a week, it's like a family. There are also exchanges between coaches and players. We exchange opinions, we exchange memories, or now, especially in this corona crisis, especially the problems we have, everything, just everything. So here we see that effectively self-narratives are evolving into joint narratives, and hence people become part of a wider society that is, you know, family. Right, just to wrap up the presentation. So this is where we stand, and then these are the things that we like to explore in this volume as well. So when people find someone similar, then their interactions tend to become more meaningful, and then hereby we're exploring social intimacies, how they come about, and how self-narratives matter to affect one's decision to participate in everyday narratives. Because as you remember, we said that, you know, first we express practically who am I to ourselves, and then from there we start moving on to establish intimacies with the wider society. Here we refer to building joint narratives, and then we say that social variant of integration finally cannot be measured through indicators, and then rather than that, we need to pay more attention on narratives in order to generate deeper understanding of migrant experiences and how they become parts of the wider society. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I heard I'd jump in already, but you know, it'd be interesting to see whether you feel your work is subject to the kind of critique that I'm going to present in a moment. But what kind of I wonder about is the sort of normative assumption of consensus that still seems to be found in this kind of research. People get, you know, finding examples of people getting along and, you know, building relations with each other in a context where, of course, you've got migrants settling in extremely deprived and marginal, poor kinds of places. The local, you know, I think talk it a bit. If you could talk a bit more about the local, you know, the relationship with the local population. You know, if it is, for example, a poor white so-called native population that we're talking about them building relationships with, or whether it's relationships amongst different migrant groups. And of course, the important thing here is that, I mean, it's great if they build some sort of relationship with the local population who are in a similarly sort of dominated marginal kind of position in the wider society, but it has to lead to something like a kind of mobilization or a solidarity, which itself is actually conflictual with other kinds of relations in society for it to be a change, you know, for it to have any kind of political change attached to it. So it's, I mean, I'm sort of making a point about, you know, how they might, how the narratives might, the joint narratives might be identifying common class positions, which then lead to kind of political mobilizations against, you know, middle class people or
yeah,
you know, the dominant society.
Thank you. I think what you're asking here is something that we're going to look into our new radicalization, de-radicalization project, because it's exactly about this, how we really, you know, reach out to people who are practically on the margins of society, regardless of their background, and whether they are there to produce common groups of solidarity, as you say, confrontational, to build common class positions. But in this research, we had 42 volunteers from 7 European sites, and then some of the EU nationals, as the call wanted us to classify them to be, they were also of ethnic minority background. Some of them were not, but I mean, I'm aware of the Glasgow group much better than the others. Perhaps my colleagues from other places, they can just jump in. And I was quite interested to see and to find out that they had collective problems. So they could agree on what their common problems were, such that despite their background, they were there to talk about the fact that they were living in like dangerous neighborhoods. And then, when you start talking about your common problems, in that case, you're already building your common narratives as well. They were there to talk about the fact that they struggle with their everyday relationships. There were some issues to do with like body confidence. There were some issues to do with like joining parts of wider teams during their volunteering, considering their particular class background, etc. So, and then out of these people, some of them were ethnically white Scottish. The others were newcomers. But what separated them from each other in some contexts was the accent. That some of them, they did not really have the Scottish accent because they were not born in Scotland, although they lived here long. And then we came across that those who were not born here and those who lacked Scottish accent, they really wanted to make sure that we take them as part of the wider Scottish society. How did it happen? Through them praising the Scottish government, SNP government, saying that, well, this is an inclusive society. You ask why? They say, well, because they write it there, because there's all this propaganda that Glasgow welcomes people, or Scotland is a welcoming society and all that. So they say that, well, it's an inclusive society because we heard so, or it's inclusive society because we were shown it to be. But then again, you look into their everyday examples, and then they struggle with accent, with color, and all that. So in their case, it was, I think, possible to establish a form of solidarity based on their socioeconomic background, but it was not really possible to build this solidarity based on ethnic background. So I believe still, socioeconomic background could be a way for them to build solidarity. And my approach to this thing would be socioeconomic background would present practically common problems. And if you realize that, regardless of your background, where you're born, etc., you have to deal with terrible transportation, expensive housing, girlfriend, boyfriend problems, etc., then you have some kind of thing, an issue to talk to each other about, right? But when it comes to, how you express yourself, your accent, and the terminology that you use, then you really start to be, separated in society because you're told that you don't belong as you don't really have the Scottish accent. So, however, I take your comment that we have a normative assumption here and normative assumption of consensus very seriously, because this is something, obviously, all social research sometimes just gets really bogged into, their little own thing, and then they tend to keep, they tend to forget about this thing. Yes, I think that you're right. There's a normative assumption here of consensus, but then again, we're working with a small group of people, and then we're looking into microsites and everyday intimacies in these microsites. Thank you. I know that there are many questions here, so I will just shift to is that to Emily or to Andrea? Emily, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. It's fantastically interesting paper, and I can see you have some incredibly rich data. Thank you very much for sharing it with us. I'm a social psychologist at the University of the West of England, and I'm also a narrative scholar. So a lot of my work is underpinned by Brunner and other sort of theorists around narrative. And I wanted to ask sort of 3 questions, mainly with an eye to understanding the kinds of contributions you're looking for in the edited volume, but also potentially just as a critique, just to see, if you've thought about these issues. The first one is, so I love the idea of choosing new terminology. And I very much appreciate why you've moved away potentially from the integration word. I was curious about the choice of moving from migrant to newcomer, simply because I thought, you know, I've been in the UK for 15 years, but I'm still integrating, but I don't feel like a newcomer. So is there potentially a risk with the word newcomer implying that they've arrived very recently, whereas somebody can still continue to be on an integration journey 20 years after arriving in a place and not feel like a newcomer? So I just wanted to ask about that. And then just also curious about why you moved from community to host society. You might have a very good rationale, but it just wasn't sure what that was. The second thing I wanted to bring up was I wanted to ask how you were defining narrative, because when I started working in the area of narrative and writing in the area of narrative, I got quite skewered by some narrative scholars early on who said what you're talking about is not narrative. Qualitative data is not synonymous with narrative. Narrative is a particular type of qualitative data that is storied. And it struck me, and I appreciate that when you're showing it on a PowerPoint, you're always putting very short excerpts. So it's really hard sometimes to get the narrative context of those excerpts. I do appreciate that at all. But I wanted to know if you could reflect a little bit on why what you're talking about are narratives as opposed to just identities, social groups. And as I say, I'm a great proponent of thinking about identity as narrative, but there are other ways of thinking about identity where it's just, you know, belonging in different kinds of social groups. And what is the narrative underpinning of this as opposed to just kind of a piece of research on relationships and, you know, how different identities do and don't develop. Then the final thing I wanted to ask was about, it was interesting, you kind of presented a sort of a linear picture of how an individual first develops an internal narrative of the self, and then they turn external, and that internal narrative of the self influences the way they interact with and you know, fit into or don't wider narratives. But there's an area of narrative scholarship that says there's always a listener. No narrative exists independent of the person who's listening to the narrative. So I just wondered about the sort of linear presentation of that, and whether or not it is the case that we really do carry a narrative within ourselves, a narrative of identity, independent of the teller, if that makes sense. Those are my reflections. Thanks very much.
Great questions, Emily. I'm going to come back to that, but I'm taking Andrea's question as well because I'm a bit wary of time. Andrea?
Hey, Umut, great, very interesting presentation as usual. Quick question. Also, I was wondering why you choose the word the host society, like Emily just mentioned, because I don't think it match well with the other two words. You have mobility and newcomer. This seems like more inclusive. I feel the word host society somehow goes in a different assumption, or kind of assume as behind the word to me. And then I have a question. It's more a provocation. I was wondering why there was the concept of joint narratives. I want to put the focus on the idea of jointness. Why do we need this when we talk about integration of migrants? If I refer to South European society where I'm located, we don't even have joint narrative where we have Italian and Germans before migration or mobility, used to 1061. We don't have a joint narrative in South Europe, but it's about being part of the society. So why do we want a joint narrative when we speak about migration and people, or these newcomers, whatever terms you want? Why jointness is so important to be integrated when we don't ask this to people that don't have this migrant background?
Great questions. So the first thing is I'm going to say like why we are coming up with this new terminology, like newcomer, host society, etc. It is very much thanks to actually Kezi Mahendra's work, which is very influential on us. To understand, to approach migration as a journey of like mobility, like based on practically where you're situated in terms of your mobility. And as Casey, I'm sure we'll go into these details, describes this practically. There's always a difference between those who always lived in the same apartment or in the same house all their lives. But immediately there's a difference, you know, to that if someone practically moved from, let's say, Bristol to London, because they would have experienced the mobility already. So in that case, we're looking into this thing as a spectrum of mobility rather than, you know, trying to stick into like this person is a migrant, right? No, we have to understand that we are always on the move, and everyone experiences mobility and migration to a certain extent. Coming to that, I mean, it's a very good question. Practically, like you've been in Britain for 15 years. Are you a migrant? Are you a newcomer? Like, who are you, right? I think it just depends on how you define yourself, like where you situate yourself on this mobility spectrum. And then I think that it's not really linear either. I mean, we may have given that impression, but I don't think that it will always be true, because you can have certain trauma in your life that you may have thought that, well, I belong to this society, I'm part of the society. And now you really face this trauma, and now you're told that you're non-indigenous. And all of a sudden, all your, like the belongingness that you develop with the society could be shattered. And now you understand that, well, you're a newcomer. You will always be a newcomer because, you look different or you speak different. So in that case, we were very keen on sticking to newcomer in order to present that everyone could be a newcomer, regardless of their ethnic, religious, linguistic background, because simply this is our movement on a spectrum of mobility. And this also comes to community host society. I mean, we were discussing this host society a bit more. We were trying to say, should it be citizens? Should we say that we are trying to replace citizens with the concept of host society? But then we thought that, well, I mean, people of various ethnic background, they could also be citizens. Like, how do we in that case describe them? And for us, host society became practically, regardless of citizenship, how you feel yourself belonging to that particular environment and society as the host. And there we thought that we could really go beyond this kind of, I believe, superficial constraints such as ethnicity, religion, and race, and etc. So narratives is a very, very good question. I mean, Emily, you really hit us there. Thank you very much for raising this question. And I'm a political scientist by training, so probably my approach to narratives would be a bit different than yours. I think you're a sociologist or ethnographer. So you're saying that, I mean, what we have here is a representation of identities. For me, actually, the way you describe your identity is already the way that you set the narrative about yourself. So that's what I look into in order to understand practically how you embrace the overall narrative and how you negotiate that yourself vis-a-vis the overall narrative. And that thereby, I'm not really I don't want to constrain myself too methodologically, let's say, practically this narrative, this is discourse, this is that, etc. I want to have a kind of a more embracing approach to the empirical data, and would like to use this empirical data in order for me to understand how identities are expressed. Now, Andrea, you say that why do we need this joint narrative? I mean, after all this, yeah, she's a social psychologist. Thank you, Emily. Why do we need them? I mean, don't you think that, Andrea, there is this consciousness of being from South Tyrol, and then, talking about the weather in South Tyrol, talking about the cuisine in South Tyrol, talking about its beauty, like going for skiing, these kind of mundane everyday activities that constructs the joint narrative about South Tyrol, regardless of people's linguistic background. Listen, I mean, we need to start Adrian's keynote now. If I may I actually keep the rest of the questions and the discussions after Adrian's talk, because I know that Adrian's talk is going to speak to our paper as well. And thank you very, very much for joining the panel this morning.